It stood for 28 years, painfully dividing East and West Germany, but the Berlin Wall finally came down on November 9, 1989. This is what the day felt like for those who lived through it. Life in the GDR was brutal, characterized by food shortages and the constant fear of betrayal or arrest. And after decades of living under a dictatorship, the East German people were finally expressing their anger. On November 4, 1989, more than 500,000 East Germans gathered in the streets to demand free elections. Their demonstrations made an impact. The ruling party of the GDR was already losing political sway thanks to the economic and political turmoil of the entire Eastern Bloc. Change was in the air that November, but nobody in the East, or the West for that matter, was expecting what came on November 9th. That very morning, November 9th, 1989, started out like any other for most Germans, whether they lived in East or West Berlin. Before we get too far into this, let's just step back and lay out how we got here. The Westes and Ossis, as the citizens of the West and the East sectors of the city were respectively known, have been divided since 1949, with the formation of the Western Federal Republic of Germany, or FRG, and the Eastern German Democratic Republic, or GDR, as mentioned earlier. From 1961, the city also had been split by a physical barrier, which the GDR began constructing by surprise on the night of August 13th. Just to throw the East Germans off the trail, they called it the Anti-Fascist Protection Rampart. Of course, the true purpose of the Berlin Wall was ostensibly to slow the tide of East Germans escaping to the more prosperous and free FRG.
And democracy is not perfect. But we have never had to put a wall up to keep our people in.
The Berlin Wall was heavily guarded by patrols, attack dogs, and 55,000 active landmines. To be granted legal passage was rare, but many Easterners still attempted to escape to the west. As recently as March 8, 1989, Winfried Freudenberg had died in a balloon crash attempting to escape East Germany. He holds the dubious distinction of being the last East German to die attempting to defect to West Berlin. On the evening of November 9th, Günter Schabowski, a senior member of the GDR Politburo, gave a press conference that would trigger the beginnings of German reunification, forever changing the lives of German citizens on both sides of the wall. Schabowski had been a longtime official for the East German Socialist Unity Party, known as the SED, and had been instrumental in the recent ousting of the party leader, Erich Honecker, in favor of Egon Krenz. On the day Schabowski gave his infamous press conference, he was one of the most powerful people in the GDR. The presser was expected to go like any other. He would announce the loosening of travel restrictions as a result of the popular protests that had swamped the country. The announcement was meant to be an incremental change in policy, but Schabowski made a critical mistake. Well into his boring hour-long speech, he misread his notes and announced, "Permanent relocation can be done through all border checkpoints between the GDR and to the FRG or West Berlin." This was nothing short of a bombshell. One journalist asked when the regulations would take effect, and Schabowski replied,
"As far as I know, this goes into effect immediately, without delay."
It meant that East Germans could pass directly into the West without restrictions for the first time in nearly 3 decades. Schabowski made his notoriously bungled statement just before 7 p.m. Berlin time, in front of dozens of journalists. Tom Brokaw, who was there, later said, "It felt as if a signal had come from outer space and electrified the room." Footage of his announcement went out just minutes later at 7:17 on the East German ZDF network, and by 8 p.m. it was on the West German equivalent, the ARD.
The East German authorities have said, in essence, that the Berlin Wall doesn't mean anything anymore.
Did Schabowski really mean what he had said? Did he even know what he had said? Either way, he didn't backtrack. He told the stunned journalists, "I'm not quite sure, but I was told that this information was forwarded to you already. I suppose you have got this release already." News anchorman Hans J. Friedrichs told his audience, "This 9th of November is a historic day. The GDR has announced that starting immediately, its borders are open to everyone. The gates in the wall stand open wide." The East German border guards patrolling the Berlin Wall were entirely unaware of Schabowski's proclamation, and matters could easily have gotten out of hand when, shortly after the announcement of free travel into West Berlin was broadcast, citizens on both sides of the wall began to descend upon the border in huge numbers, demanding that the checkpoints be opened. Confusion reigned, but for the moment, the Berlin Wall was still standing, and attempting to cross it could be deadly. Lieutenant Colonel Harald Jäger was the Stasi officer in charge of the Bornholmerstrasse checkpoint. He'd held the job for 25 years, and through all that time, his loyalty to the regime had been unwavering. After watching Schabowski's press conference on TV, he described it as deranged. He sought clarification on the border situation by making phone calls to his superiors without success. Once on duty, Yeager found himself trying to convince the growing and increasingly impatient crowd that border crossing was still forbidden. Like the guards at every checkpoint along the wall, Yeager and his men were armed, but no one in his command chain was willing to authorize the use of force against the East German crowds.
So there was no need to train for this case. Opening the border crossing would have been considered high treason.
Luck had something to do with the events of that evening. The timing of Schabowski's press conference was key. Many East German officials were already asleep as the situation escalated a few hours later, leaving people like Yeager to take matters into their own hands. Looking back, many journalists and historians have pinpointed Yeager's actions as an important reason there was no bloodshed that night. The crowds continued to gather and press the guards at the checkpoints as the night went on. Years later, Yeager spoke to Al Jazeera about what happened and his role in defusing what could have been a powder keg of violence. His complicated feelings about that night, explaining, "It was the best night and the worst night." After a lifetime of loyalty to the GDR, Yeager recalled, "The worst part was that I felt completely abandoned by my superiors. I was left in the lurch." With no direction from those in charge, Yeager and his men began to allow some of the loudest agitators to pass into the west, hoping it would relieve the growing tension, but that only increased the crowd's fervor. Thousands began to chant, "Open the gate! Open the gate!" at the beleaguered border guards. Vastly outnumbered and aware that the tide was quickly turning against them, Yeager and his men opened the Bornholmerstrasse checkpoint, allowing German citizens to pass freely into West Berlin, effectively standing down from their posts. Photographer Fabrizio Bensch, no relation, was waiting at Checkpoint Charlie on the western side with thousands of others shortly after hearing that the checkpoints were open. But by 9 p.m., the eastern side was still empty. Perhaps they'd been misinformed? Perhaps the East had cracked down on their citizens? The information was so thin on the ground that nobody could tell for sure. Then came the sight of a lone East German running through the checkpoint with his GDR passport held aloft. Bensch reports that the man, upon seeing the crowd gathered to meet him, fell into the arms of strangers and burst into tears. Along the wall, strangers were celebrating together with food and champagne, treating the occasion like a reunion with long-lost family. And in many cases, that's exactly what it was.
She called me up. "Mama, come here. I want to walk with you across the Bornholmer Bridge, our bridge of suffering."
30 years later, Pastor Werner Krotschel, a GDR dissident who later found out that his phones had been bugged by the Stasi, shared his memories with the New York Times. He, his daughter, and her 21-year-old friend piled into the pastor's yellow Wartburg and headed to the west. Krotschel said the moment felt like landing on the moon. Every picture of the fall of the Berlin Wall bristles with the electricity of the occasion. Today, we are treated with a vast array of images that capture the spirit of the occasion and the joyous sense of the togetherness that descended upon a city that had been divided so ruthlessly for so long. Almost every image from that day is iconic, but those that have the most symbolic resonance for us today are perhaps those of ordinary Berliners destroying the physical barrier that had separated them from their neighbors, the wall itself. Using household tools like chisels, as well as heavy-duty sledgehammers, people began to break the wall down piece by piece. Those people, who've earned the German name Mauerspechte, literally wall woodpeckers, populate some of the most defining images of the events of the day, when power was taken from the oppressive GDR government and returned, quite literally, to the hands of the people. Although many East Berliners were met with champagne upon their arrival in the West, most sources report that November 9, 1989 was a sober gathering, propelled by the communal ecstasy of the occasion. As Reuters described it, the fall of the Berlin Wall was a gathering of strangers united in a euphoric moment. More than booze, it was the basic foods East Berliners had been denied for so long that were shared and carried around as totems long into the night. Bananas especially became a key symbol of the possibilities now available to East Berliners whose lives, up until that point, had been haunted by scarcity and food shortages. The moment also opened the eyes of many East Berliners, loyal to the GDR, who believed their government's assurances that conditions in the East weren't so bad. One newly liberated East Berliner told Reuters, "Thinking of how hard we'd worked all these years and how things weren't so bad, I was dismayed to see capitalism is so far ahead." The celebrations continued into the next day, and in total, more than 2 million people descended upon the wall before the weekend was through, enjoying the atmosphere and new freedoms that had suddenly become reality. From the Brandenburg Gate and Potsdamer Platz to Bornholmerstrasse and Bernauer Strasse, the city was a sea of thawing tensions and explosive jubilation. The ecstatic crowds were addressed at Schöneberg Town Hall by Nobel Peace Prize winner Willy Brandt, former Chancellor of West Germany. He said, "We are experiencing, and that is something grand, and I am thankful to the Lord God that I could witness this. We are experiencing the parts of Europe growing together again." Brandt was met with cheers, but the next speaker, West German Chancellor Helmut Kohl, was booed. But Kohl's part in keeping events on track cannot be overstated. Years later, Reuters reported that Kohl received a call from then-Soviet Premier Mikhail Gorbachev, who asked if the rumors were true that protesters were attacking Soviet military posts. Kohl, about to go on stage, had no idea and was unable to check, but he promised Gorbachev that the rumors were false, thereby avoiding potential Russian military intervention. Brandt was one of the few politicians advocating for a quick and painless reunification of Germany, and that's exactly what he got. After East Germans overwhelmingly voted to merge with the West on October 3, 1990, the two countries merged, becoming the Federal Republic of Germany.
By this time, much of the 156-kilometer wall had been demolished.
Speaking with the local, photographer Heinrich Pastor commented, "You couldn't demolish it like that if you planned. In 3 days, it was a mess. You couldn't take a photograph of it as it used to be anywhere. It was over."